Hi everyone, welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell. Today is our 200th show, and I just want to say how thankful I am to each and every person who's come on the show as a guest. They were brave to come on, and we were so glad that that they were able to share their stories and just let us all know the diversity and richness and variety of our community. So I thank each one of them. I thank the BCTV team, without which we wouldn't be here at all, obviously. So that's the core team of Core Trowbridge, and Nolan Edgar, and Van Weil, and Helena Leschuk, and the people who also started at the very beginning with me, which is almost 6 years ago now to the day. Roland Boyden, Vlasta Popelka, Aidan Meyer, and Brian Bashaw, all people who are very dear to me and who have helped so much with this show. So thank you, one and all. Today on our show, on our 200th show, we have Wyn Cooper. Wyn is a poet and songwriter. He's also a freelance editor and recently published his first novel, The Way Out West. He's written 5 books of poetry, and his work has appeared in many magazines and anthologies, including The New Yorker, Slate, Paris Review, Plowshares, and most notably, and notoriously, one of his poems, Fun, was adapted for the lyrics of the Sheryl Crow song, All I Want to Do. And you could sing along with that right now, I know. So Wyn, welcome so much.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. And to talk about what you've been doing and the various things that have been going on in your life, and a little bit about your background. You're published at a very young age.
I was in 5th grade. There was a school paper in Rochester, Michigan, where I grew up, and I wrote a silly little poem that they thought should be published, so they did. And then when I was in 8th grade, I was going out with a young woman, obviously, whose mother worked at a radio station in Detroit, which was near where I grew up. And I wrote a poem about the death of my mother, who was and is very much alive at 100 as of last month. And I gave it to Maggie. She gave it to her mother. Her mother gave it to the producer at the radio station, who gave it to the DJ who read it on the radio during the daytime when I was at school. My mother happened to be listening to that radio station that day. And when I got home from school, my mother said, "So, I'm dead, huh?" And I was, shocked and horrified that she had heard the poem. And then she said, "I'm so proud of you. You had a poem on the radio." Oh. And that was just the nicest thing. Yeah. And then when I was in high school, I was writing poetry still. And one of my English teachers arranged for me to take a day-long workshop at Wayne State University. And I did that, and that was just an incredible experience. And I ended up corresponding with the teacher and sending him more poems, and he would make comments on them. And he also gave me a reading list of books. Wow. And that is what really helped me more than anything, was the books that he recommended to me. Because in high school, we had to read a lot of older poetry, and he had recommended much more interesting, sort of out there poetry. It turned the tide for me, and then I studied creative writing in college and graduate school, and then another graduate school. So there you go.
You've been writing your whole life.
Yeah, I have.
Back, I think, in really early days, was it kindergarten or 1st grade?
Right.
You had a special guest come into your classroom?
We did. My kindergarten teacher was named Mrs. Mitchell, and her son was Chuck Mitchell, who had married Joni Mitchell. And she brought Joni in to sing to our school, which was magical. She sang Puff the Magic Dragon and I'm a GNU, spelled G-N-U. And so Joni was my first crush. I'm not sure what grade I was in. I wasn't in kindergarten. I was maybe in 3rd grade or something like that. And so that was, that maybe got me more interested in music than anything else had so far.
Oh really? You think it influenced you musically?
Well,
yeah, why not?
I had a crush on her, and she was a singer. So.
And had she gotten some fame by that time?
I don't think
Probably
so.
She
was still in a duo with Chuck, her then husband, and I think they were just relatively unknown folk singers in Michigan and in Canada.
So you must have been pretty close to the border. For that kind of cross.
Just an hour away from the border.
In high school, you were the editor of the school newspaper.
I was. I was also the editor of the underground newspaper at the high school. So I kind of had my fingers in both buckets.
Aha. So you were bringing in things that were a little bit more avant-garde to the high school?
Or just a little things that were upsetting to the principal, for example.
Yeah.
You know, trying to look at what was really going on behind the scenes at the high school.
Oh,
and, you know, it was just sophomoric, idiotic stuff, but I was thrilled to be doing it.
But you were a sophomore, and you know,
Right, I was a sophomore.
we were all sophomoric and idiotic.
Right.
And you actually did a little film in high school, I believe.
I did. I went to high school with Madonna, the Madonna, and I had a film class where we were supposed to make films, and I ended up making a film with her and another girl. I think they were 16. I think I was 17.
Yeah.
And we, if you Google it, if you Google Madonna student film Wyn Cooper, you will come across it. It's 1 minute long. Madonna eats a raw egg and then spits it back out slowly over herself. And then we make it, and then Carol cracks an egg on Madonna's stomach. And through the magic of Scotch tape on 8mm film, I made it look like the egg was frying. And then suddenly there was a fried egg on her stomach. Carol put salt and pepper on it and ate it off her stomach. They were both wearing bikinis.
Yes.
I got an A on the film. So
I saw the
there you
film.
go. Oh, you did?
I
Right.
did. I looked it up and I saw it, and you can tell it's Madonna.
Yeah.
She looks, I can't say she looks the same, but she's definitely recognizable.
Right.
It is a weird little film.
Yeah, it is. Yes, it is.
Well, after those experiences in your very early years, which are
Right.
pretty amazing, you went to the University of Utah and
I did.
studied writing.
I did.
Continuing to write. Were you mainly focused on poetry then?
Yes, I was. I really never wrote any fiction until I wrote my novel some years later. No, I just wrote poetry and, of course, papers for English classes.
Right, right.
And then after I graduated, I went to Hollins College in Virginia to get a master's in writing. It was really creative writing, but they just call it writing there. Then I went to the PhD program back at the University of Utah, where I studied with a couple of very noted poets, Larry Levis and Mark Strand. And Mark Strand gave me probably the best advice I've ever gotten from a writing teacher or from anyone in the writing world. He said, "I only ask one thing of all of you, just don't bore me." And so very often when I sit down to write, which I try to do every day, I think of that line, just don't bore me. I don't want to bore the reader. I don't want to bore myself. And so that, that lifts your standard up a little bit, at least a little bit, to not be boring. My first book is primarily narrative poetry. And that came out in 1987. That includes the poem Fun. And for the most part, the poems in that book told stories. And which is what narrative poetry does, obviously. And it takes a little longer to tell a story than it does to write a lyrical poem such as a sonnet. Sonnets don't really tell stories. They're more about a moment in time, for example. And so as my poetry progressed over the years, I moved away from narrative poetry and into lyrical poetry, and the poems just got shorter.
Yeah.
And I miss writing long poems, and I try all the time to write long poems. And so sometimes I just write a bunch of short poems and then I string them together to see if I can make a long poem. But I've rarely had a poem that's over 2 pages. And I've rarely had ones that were over 1 page.
Really, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this and looking at your poems, reading your poems, and thinking, some of them, there's something about that short form that is so not only makes it graspable in a way, but it's almost like haiku, and
Right.
I'm wondering, I wanted to ask you, do you feel like that, if you want to call it a method or technique or just the way you write, is it getting to the bones of what you're trying to say? Is it getting to the essence more?
Yeah, I think it is. It's also, I drop out any language that I don't like the sound of, and I focus far more on the sounds of the words than even on the content of the words.
Yeah.
And when I give workshops or whatever, and students or audience members ask me how I start writing a poem, I explain to often mystified faces that I think that I primarily write from my unconscious. I sit down and I write down some words that sound good together. Then I write lines of poetry, or sometimes I just write a paragraph and then I break that down into lines, but I'm always more concerned with the sound of the poem than anything else. And the reason I think that works out okay is because, I don't have any proof of this, but I believe that human beings are hardwired to make sense. And I've used this when I used to teach. I would tell my students, write a poem that makes no sense. They pretty much could not do that. They would write something that they didn't think made sense, and then I would read it back to them and explain to them what was going on in this poem. And they would have this kind of moment. And I know that anybody listening to this interview is going to say, oh, that's a bunch of crap. I'll write one and send it to Wyn right now.
Good idea.
Yeah, good idea. Don't give them my email. And so so my poems do end up making sense.
Yes.
But the way to keep them sounding really good is to pay more attention to that than anything. And that often is why a 30-line poem becomes an 18-line poem, because I'm stripping out any awkward words. I try not to use any words that are even 4 syllables or more, because those don't roll off the tongue. I mean, some words do, serendipity, but a lot of words don't. And when I work with other poets as an editor, which I do for a living, I'm always just saying things like, you can't use words that are more than 4 syllables. They're, why? And then I explain to them, I have all kinds of rules about poetry that I tell people not to take too seriously, but that's one of them.
Yeah.
So.
Well, do you think that also hinges on, I think, a thing that many of us carry, which is the purity of poetry. There's something about poetry that brings things to their core.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely, that's one of the things that differentiates it from prose. Although a lot of the fiction that I like is very stripped down, and there's not a whole lot of extra words. And I'm editing a novel right now, and part of the problem with it is it just has too many words that don't need to be in there, and so I'm constantly cutting things out, saying, what purpose does this sentence serve?
One of the other things that you've talked about with writing is that you can think that you're in a rut, but you're really on a roll.
Right.
Yeah, that kind of plays into that as well, right? To like the process itself.
Right, it does. I was asked by one of my former Marlboro College students, Josh Harmon, he was guest editing a literary magazine, and he got like 3 or 4 postcard poems in the mail in one day, and he thought that was bizarre. Postcard from Nashville, postcard from, things like that. And so he contacted his writer friends, including me, and asked us all to write a postcard poem from the town that we lived in. And I live in Halifax, Vermont. And I said, what do you mean a postcard poem? And he said, just write about something or someone quirky in your town. And I remember saying, well, that's going to be pretty easy because everyone and everything in my town is pretty quirky. And it was so much fun that I wrote 200 more of them from different places in Vermont, different places in the country and in the world, and then eventually from outer space. And then I wrote some from emotions.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I narrowed that down to what I thought were the 50 best poems, mailed that off, and got a publisher. So that was great.
I love that format. I think there's something so appealing about that, appealing and accessible for people.
Absolutely.
And the size, because you can visualize that size.
Right.
The other story I remember, Wyn, correct me if I'm wrong, when you were writing Postcards from the Interior, Michaela Harlow, who was a neighbor of yours, was sort of across the way, doing paintings that were postcard paintings. Is that correct?
Yes, and I asked her, I've always admired her paintings, and I asked her if I could come to her house, or come to her studio and look at some of her paintings to see if there was something that might work on the cover of my book. And she said, well, tell me about the poems. And I said, well, they're postcard poems. And she said, oh my God, I've been doing postcard paintings for 2 years. So we had both been doing our versions of postcards for the same amount of time over the same years.
In the same vicinity. Cool coincidence.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think it was recently you opened up the Vermont House of Representatives.
I did.
Was that this year?
That was this year. It was on April 24th, I believe, April 25th. And I was asked by the representative in Halifax if I would come and read just, a few poems at the beginning of the session. And that was, it was a little bit intimidating, but it went really well, and I was so impressed by how much attention everyone in that audience, because there were, so not just the representatives, there was an audience. A lot of people just go, and they sit in the back of the room. So there were, probably a couple hundred people there, and it was, you could have heard a pin drop, and I thought, wow,
That's
don't
so
always
cool.
get an audience like this.
That's right.
And that went very, very well. And then they gave me the flag that had been flying over the Capitol building that morning.
Oh, wow.
They took it down and gave it to me.
Wow, that's
and then,
like...
put another one up for the next poet.
Did they fold it in a special way?
They
and everything?
did.
Did they? That's
They
so
did.
cool.
So it's a triangle.
Yeah. That's great,
And
Wyn.
it came with a little plaque, well, not a plaque, but just a piece of paper that was signed by the
Commemorating.
Sergeant at Arms or something like that. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
It was pretty great.
Vermont.
Yeah.
Right, Vermont's so great. You are an avid skier.
I am.
I forgot all about that. I thought
I
of it
am.
this afternoon. So is that how you got to Brattleboro? Was that one of the enticers?
Sort of. Well, it's why I went to college at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, because they have, as it says on their license plates, the greatest snow on earth. And so I went there to college. I was more interested in skiing when I was 18 than I was in college.
Yeah.
And then I realized I liked college, and I liked studying writing especially.
Yeah.
But I did ski. I have this written down somewhere. I skied, I think it was 80 days my freshman year of college. So that kind of shows you how hardcore I was.
Yeah.
And I worked at a ski resort, so I would get a free pass. And then I cut down on my skiing after I realized how much I liked college, and so I, cut down to 30 or 40 days every season.
Yeah.
I ended up in Brattleboro because I had a job at Marlborough College. But part of that, I taught at Bennington College before that, and I did not mind moving to Vermont because I knew there was good skiing here. So,
So
that
that's
is, they're very connected, yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you ended up here, and I'm glad you had something to do while you were thinking about poetry. Was it college that you met Madison Smart Bell,
Yes.
who became a compatriot over the years? and
I met him in
collaborator?
1980, a master's program at Hollins College, which I mentioned before. And we became very good friends. We're still very good friends. In fact, he came and stayed with me this past weekend here in Vermont. And then he became a very well-known novelist. He asked me if I would write lyrics that would be written from the point of view of the main character of the novel he was writing at that time. So I read the novel, and I got inside the head of the main character, and then I wrote some song lyrics that I thought he would write, that would come out of his mind. And I got a cassette in the mail, and he had set it to music. He's a good guitarist, but it never dawned on me that that was part of his motive for having me write one song lyric, and it was a pretty good song. And so I then kept writing more, and I kept getting cassettes in the mail. And then I brought him up to Brattleboro. We went into a recording studio, and we made demos with different local musicians playing and singing. And then we got a record deal with a small label in North Carolina. They brought us down there, and they hired some really amazing musicians. And they hired Don Dixon, who was the early producer of REM and the Smithereens and so on. And he was our producer, which I just could not believe this was happening. And then when the album came out, we had a guy in LA that really liked our songs. And so we let him represent us. And he got our songs onto 5 television shows, some of which are still in reruns today. True Blood and Bones and The Unit. I can't remember what the other ones are. We went back and got the same musicians and the same producer and made our second record, which is based largely on my Postcard poems. The first album is called 40 Words for Fear, which is a poem from my second book. About half of the songs are based on my poems, and the other half are based on song lyrics that I wrote specifically for those projects.
When one thing you said that really impressed me, and I don't remember where I read it, but you were talking about the relationship between poetry and songwriting, and you were saying that the root of the word lyrics is lyra, the instrument lyra, which goes way back to Greek times, right?
It does.
And so you know, knowing that, I love etymology like that anyway.
Right, I do too.
But we know, I think, innately that we're listening to poetry, you know, and
Right.
hence all of the hours we spent looking at liner notes, right?
Right.
And looking at the song, the lyrics of
Right,
all of those
right.
albums. For many of us, we were taking in poetry in ways that we didn't
Right.
realize.
Yeah.
You know. Some of it was really bad, but some of it was extraordinary.
Right.
You wrote a book of fiction, which was published last year,
Yes.
Way Out West.
Uh-huh.
It's a really interesting book. I really recommend it to
Thank
folks.
you. Well, the story behind it is, it's when I tell people when I wrote the novel, they sort of can't believe it. One friend read it recently and said, "Why did you write a novel that takes place in the 1980s?" And I said, "Well, because I wrote it in the 1980s. And when I was in the PhD program at Utah, one of my fellow poets said, "You know, if I write a page a day of fiction, in a year I'll have a novel." And we all laughed at him. And then I thought, well, if Harvey can do that, I bet I can do that. And so I just tried to write a page a day.
Yeah.
And I usually wrote more than a page a day. And after a year, it was a little over a year, I had a novel. And I sent it out to a few New York, you know, big publishing houses. I sent it to a couple agents in New York. I got some nice letters back, but they were rejection letters. And I really, really hate rejection. And so I never sent it out again for 34 years. After all of that time, my friend Madison Bell published a book with Concord Free Press in Concord, Massachusetts. And that gave me the idea to send the manuscript to that press. And the editor I think he took 5 months, and then he accepted it. And I was just thrilled beyond belief.
Yeah.
We had to come up with a new title. I did a fair amount of revision, including changing the plot, believe it or not. And then it came out last year, and it went into a second printing a week after it came out.
That's good.
So I don't know exactly how it's doing right now, but
Yeah.
I kind of don't care. I'm just so happy that I have a novel out in the world.
Yeah.
It's really one of the biggest thrills of my life.
Oh, that's so great. The New Yorker story, I thought, was another great story.
Oh, well, most poets, I think, want to publish a poem in the New Yorker. And so when I was in graduate school, I started sending to the New Yorker, and I hate rejection, and I've got, you know, many rejections from them, but I would often get a note from whoever the poetry editor was at that time. And believe it or not, I keep such careful track of where I send poems and when I send them and whether or not I get a rejection and whether or not that person writes me a note. I have a notebook that goes back to 1981 that has a record of every submission I've ever made. And so when the New Yorker accepted a poem of mine 3 or 4 years ago, I went back through that record and found out that it was the 10th time I had submitted to them over a period of 33 years. And when I made the submission that ended up, you know, being the lucky one, I had written a poem that I thought was the best poem I'd ever written. And I was so tired of getting rejected by the New Yorker that I thought to myself, if they reject these 3 poems, especially that one poem, then I'm never going to send to them again. And then they accepted that poem. So there you go.
That's a good story. That's a good story to anybody out there who is submitting.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah. Make a deal. Make
Yeah.
a deal with the devil. So Sheryl Crow's in the recording studio trying to come up with some lyrics
Right.
for a song that wasn't working out really well, that she hadn't made an album yet.
Right.
So one of her guys goes on a break, walks
Yep.
down the street,
Yep.
walks into a bookstore and
A used bookstore called Cliff's Books in Pasadena. And she had written some of the songs that there was a collaborative thing. All the songs were written by more than one person. And they had written a few songs that were sort of about the underbelly of society. And so Bill Bottrell, the producer, found my book of poems, a used copy of my book. I thank whoever it was that didn't like my book that then sold it to a used bookstore. I wish I could, someday find out who that was, and I'll take them to dinner for not liking my poems. He was with Kevin Gilbert, the keyboard player, and they read through some of my poems and thought these are kind of a good match, especially this one poem called Fun.
Mm-hmm.
They bought the book for $1, I think it was, and brought it back to the studio and asked Sheryl to sing my poem Fun, which was 36 lines long, and they thought it worked, and they took 6 lines out of the poem, including a few words that had a lot of syllables. Genetic engineering lab was in the poem,
Interesting.
and that is not in the song, and it's pretty understandable why.
Yep.
And then they added the chorus, and my poem does not include all I want to do is have a little fun. It does not include that. Well, the first line is similar to that, yes.
Yes.
And then they added they had it take place in
Santa
LA and on
Monica.
Santa Monica Boulevard.
Yeah.
But I had actually written it in Salt Lake City in 1984.
Mm-hmm.
That poem also got rejected, I think, about 10 times by literary magazines over the next 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
But I believed in the poem and I put it in my book. Glad I did.
Incredible. That's such a great story. Such happenstance.
Yeah. My newest book is Mars Poetica.
Available at everyone's books.
Yes, and it's at Antidote Books in
Great.
Brattleboro, and it's at Book Lovers, which is the new used bookstore that's on Flat Street.
Yep.
And the books are available from the publishers. And the novel is available on Amazon as an ebook, but as a paperback, it is available only from the publisher. Mm-hmm. And that's because he doesn't want to make a deal with Amazon who would then take 60% of the price of the book, which is $16, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's available. You just go to concordfreepress.com. And if I may say a couple words about the press, it is, I think, one of the most extraordinary presses in the country, if not the world. My book is not free, but they do one book a year, or sometimes it takes 2 years to sell out, because they're not selling out. They give books away. If you go to the Concord Free Press website and just click on free book, they will send you a copy of their current book, which is called The Witch of Métanger by Madison Smart Bell. They will even pay for the postage.
Amazing.
$4 or whatever it costs to mail you the book.
Yeah.
What they ask in return is, and only if you're willing to do this, there's no pressure whatsoever. If you're willing to, they're not asking for money for them. They're asking you if you would just give money to any charity of any kind or to a person in need. And then, if you're willing to take the next step, that would be to email them and tell them how much money you gave and to what charity. And so if you go to their website, you can scroll down through the thousands of names of people who have gotten free books and have then donated to charity. And so far, they've raised over $5 million.
That's wild. As a model, you would think, lots of luck, buddy. It's amazing. It would be great to hear a couple of your poems, if you would like to read to us.
Absolutely. I want to read the title poem of Mars Poetica. Show it to the camera. Mars Poetica. Imagine you're on Mars, looking at Earth, a swirl of colors in the distance. Tell us what you miss most or least. Let your feelings rise to the surface. Skim that surface with a tiny net. Now you're getting the hang of it. Tell your story slantwise, streetwise, in the disguise of an astronaut in his suit. Tell us something we didn't know before, how words mean things we didn't know we knew.
I love that poem. Yeah.
And then I thought I would read one of my postcard poems. One of them, as I said, I wrote the initial poems I wrote all took place in Vermont and were postcards from places in Vermont. And since Harmony Parking Lot is probably the most famous parking lot in Brattleboro,
or the world,
I wrote a postcard from Harmony Parking Lot, which, years later, after the book came out, was read by Garrison Keillor on his show, which was a big thrill to hear somebody with a voice that deep reading my poem. Postcard from Harmony Parking Lot. The teens have gathered because they are teens. They wear brown shirts faded to beige, black boots, low-slung jeans. The way they stand is called jaunty. Cigarettes burn through their words, smoke blows through their hair, and the way they stare at passers-by blends reptile with bird, spleen with wonder, your past with their present to you.
Nice. Wyn, this has been lovely. This has been really fun.
I've enjoyed it very much, Wendy. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so glad, like I said, it's just so wonderful to have different folks come on the show and talk about completely different things,
Right.
from each other, and yet we're all still one big community.
Yep, we are.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks to all of you for being with us today on our 200th show. We are so glad you're with us. Stay tuned. We're going to do another 200 more, although I know I'll never catch up with Energy Week, who are into the 500s now. Anyway, stay tuned. We'll be back. We will have more folks saying more glorious things. Bye-bye.